Life in the UK Test. Chapter 3, Section 4, Part 6. Disclaimer. This work is independent and non-official. It is a free help based on life in the United Kingdom, a guide for new residents, 3rd edition handbook. December 2015. Chapter 3, Section 4, Part 6. A Global Power. Ireland in the 19th century. The right to vote. Ireland in the 19th century. Conditions in Ireland were not as good as in the rest of the UK. 2/3 of the population still depended on farming to make their living, often on very small plots of land. In the middle of the century the potato crop failed, and Ireland suffered a famine. 1 million people died from disease and starvation. Another 1.5 million left Ireland. Some emigrated to the United States and others came to England. By 1861 there were large populations of Irish people in cities such as Liverpool, London, Manchester, and Glasgow. The Irish nationalist movement had grown strongly through the 19th century. Some, such as the Fenians, favoured complete independence. Others, such as Charles Stewart Parnell, advocated Home Rule, in which Ireland would remain in the UK but have its own parliament. The right to vote. As the middle classes in the wealthy industrial towns and cities grew in influence, they began to demand more political power. The Reform Act of 1832 had greatly increased the number of people with the right to vote. The Act also abolished the old pocket and rotten boroughs, and more parliamentary seats were given to the towns and cities. There was a permanent shift of political power from the countryside to the towns, but voting was still based on ownership of the property. This meant that members of the working class were still unable to vote. A movement began to demand the vote for the working classes and other people without property. Campaigners, called the Chartists, presented petitions to Parliament. At first they seemed to be unsuccessful, but in 1867 there was another Reform Act. This created many more urban seats in Parliament and reduced the amount of property that people needed to have before they could vote. However, the majority of men still did not have the right to vote and no women could vote. Politicians realized that the increased number of voters meant that they needed to persuade people to vote for them if they were to be sure of being elected to Parliament. The political parties began to create organizations to reach out to ordinary voters. Universal suffrage, the right of every adult, male or female, to vote, followed in the next century. In common with the rest of Europe, women in 19th century Britain had fewer rights than men. Until 1870, when a woman got married, her earnings, property and money automatically belonged to her husband. Acts of Parliament in 1870 and 1882 gave wives the right to keep their own earnings and property. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an increasing number of women campaigned and demonstrated for greater rights and, in particular, the right to vote. They formed the women's suffrage movement and became known as the suffragettes. Emmeline Pankhurst, 1858 to 1928. Emmeline Pankhurst was born in Manchester in 1858. She set up the Women's Franchise League in 1889, which fought to get the vote in local elections for married women. In 1903 she helped found the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. This was the first group whose members were called suffragettes. The group used civil disobedience as part of their protests to gain the vote for women. They chained themselves to railings, smashed windows and committed arson. Many of the women, including Emmeline, went on hunger strike. In 1918, women over the age of 30 were given voting rights and the right to stand for Parliament, partly in recognition of the contribution women made to the war effort during the First World War. Shortly before Emmeline's death in 1928, women were given the right to vote at the age of 21, the same as men. Study materials. All chapters from the study materials are Crown copyright and have been based on Life in the United Kingdom, a guide for new residents 3rd edition handbook. All photos are borrowed from wikipedia.org under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 unported. This work is independent and non-official, prepared in December 2015.